This is a production of Cornell University.
Well, thank you so much for coming out, and it's really a pleasure to be back here at Cornell. And I'm presenting on a topic that's really special to me. So I'll start off with just an introduction to why this topic is important, and then some of the research that I did for my thesis, and then Don will give you an overview of what's happening here at Cornell with an exciting new initiative. For me, the topic of how nature affects well-being started more in the arts than it did in the sciences. I studied art history for a while, and I've always loved this painting by Van Gogh. And he wrote in a letter to his brother how much looking at nature was a comfort to him in his final years when he was confined to an asylum. He continued to paint, and it was really the connection for his sanity. But what he was painting was nature, and this beautiful picture came out in one of the last years of his life. Also literature. The Secret Garden was one of my favorite books, and I really delved into it a few years ago. And again, the theme of how working in a garden restores well-being is very powerful in that story. And then, of course, Cornell. This is a picture of the 80 White House gardens, and that among all the other gardens and Cornell plantations. There's just so much beauty on this campus, and not only as a grad student, but as an undergrad, I found so much solace finding these places and little places to hide away and get away from the pressures of academic life. Okay, so there's really three core issues at the heart of my research. First, the statistics for mental health among college-age students are very shocking. There are 57% who feel overwhelming anxiety, and also 35% who have felt so depressed that it was difficult to function. I found that statistic very, very troubling. So some of these numbers are really high, and here are some numbers for what causes the most stress, academics being the top, but a whole bunch of other issues as well. But it's definitely a problem among students. So 1 in 3 really faces some kind of mental health issue, in addition to all the overwhelming stress of being a student. So that is another number that is really amazing to me. The other issue for me was public gardens at colleges and universities. They're a specific kind of public garden. They work with the university by having a mission that coincides with that of the university. And they are often fighting for their existence, trying to show that they're relevant to the university. And often that leads to some issues. There was an article that it was discussed that why should these resources be going to this organization within the university that maybe is not always clearly academic. So the issue of relevance is a key part of the equation. And then finally, the literature on these subjects. There's certainly a broad amount of literature on nature and well-being, and also within each of the areas of health and with mental health and in colleges and universities, but where they intersect, it's not as much, and it's certainly not as much when you get into the study of public gardens particularly. There are many of these gardens at colleges and universities, and yet they're not really being thought of in terms of how are they helping students beyond the academic part of their lives. So I'm just arguing the public gardens they very well could hold the keys to rejuvenation of student well-being on these campuses. And what I wanted to try to answer was whether psychological well-being, whether it's a priority at college and university gardens, and whether they can do a better job at appropriating that role. So before I get into the research part of, I had to really dig into literature, and I just want to give an overview of the way I thought of this was kind of going from a broad amount of literature down to a point, starting off with the breadth of literature on nature and well-being, but then going down and getting closer to the college and university experience. So these are some of the key thinkers that I wanted to introduce to you. Ulrich, who wrote an essay on the power of a view through hospital windows, that patients actually had a better chance of recovery and reaction to pain medications, and also fewer negative comments from nurses for when they actually had a view of nature as opposed to a brick wall. Another set of authors, the Kaplans, wrote about particularly this concept of restorative environments, and it's based on this notion that there is attention, directed attention, which is a voluntary type of attention, and it requires effort. And when that becomes fatigued, that is the core of the problem, is directed attention fatigue. And environments, natural environments particularly, have been known to soothe this, actually restore directed attention fatigue for different reasons, but particularly because often they create a feeling of being away, being set apart. They have a feeling of an extent of space. They create fascination, and all these features contribute to an environment being restorative. And these authors, actually right here at Cornell, did a really neat essay about school children and how access to nature really worked as a buffer for stress. So they have their concept of nearby nature, the value of having it close by. It was a function of how well these students responded and how it reduced their amount of stress. Richard Louv, his classic concept of nature deficit disorder, kind of close to attention deficit disorder or other mental disorders, but he puts this in the mix and says that there is a lack of interaction with nature among children, and he recommends vitamin N for vitamin nature. And then the question of the dose of nature, how much is enough? There was a study that was done that said that even a minimal amount of exposure to nature and activity in nature, just 5 minutes, was considered the most effective of any of the other amounts that were experimented with. So a small amount of time, also low intensity, was found to be effective. And also the difference in environments between urban and more natural, it didn't seem to make a difference. They were all helpful as long as they had some kind of green element. Okay, so now going just from that broad amount of literature, those are just samples. With mental health literature, common themes are that disorders appear in the first 3 decades of life, and because these are the ages that are college students, there's a high percentage on these campuses of students who suffer with these illnesses. And then there's so many other factors that affect mental well-being as well, and all of them are certainly represented on diverse campuses. The one that I found interesting was the issue of help seeking. It's something that students are notorious for not reaching out for help. And often treatment is delayed because of that. And so it's a challenge that needs to be considered. In looking for a way into how I was going to approach public gardens with this topic, I looked for other studies that were done on campuses, and there were a few. University of Massachusetts Amherst, they tried a horticultural therapy intervention. Students went in and interacted with plants. They did different techniques with a horticultural therapist, and then took a survey and found that there are some glitches in the study, but predominantly it was showing how stress was significantly relieved by this experience. At this university in Hong Kong, views of green spaces and also just the use patterns of different green spaces were analyzed, and recommendations were made based on those results. And this university in England also was interesting because it looked at different spaces on campus and found that certain spaces closer to buildings, usually more formal environments, were really much more preferred than further away, sometimes more wild or natural environments. And also that though many students knew about these spaces, only about 50% really used them. And then getting into gardens as a sort of a subset of nature, what is special about the garden particularly? And often gardens are described as a series of rooms, and there's a feeling of escape or getting away that they promote. There was an article done for the Public Garden magazine that talked about how gardens are this refuge from our difficult time that we live in, with so much information and technology and access to problems worldwide, and that the garden is a safe place. And this was after 9/11. This statement was made saying that at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, there had never been such an overflow of people who just needed that garden right after that devastating day. So how they opened their doors to people, and people really needed that space. And then in discussing gardens, there's also some literature about why we prefer gardens. And for some, it goes back to an evolutionary perspective of that we were designed to, or programmed to really want to be in an environment that feels safe, usually an open one with trees, and it takes away from the stress of that fight or flight response. The other view is, especially over most of history, was just the creation view of the history of the Garden of Eden, and just that we were made for gardens. We were made to be gardeners. And a man named Benjamin Rush, who was one of our founding fathers and a physician and early psychiatrist, he wrote about gardening as an effective means for treating the mentally ill in his day. And horticultural therapy actually owes its creation to Benjamin Rush. University gardens have a history of their own. They really developed in about the 13th century in England. Oxford and Cambridge were the result of monasteries and that dissolved, and they had cloistered gardens, these spaces that were very private and meant to be places of healing and escape for people. And these became places of institutions of learning. And then later on in Europe, and especially Italy, in the 16th century, gardens at universities started to become more incorporated into the intellectual life of the university. They became great collections, and they were studied for their plants, for their medicinal qualities, And so the concept of the garden as a living classroom really started to develop, and I think is what is predominant today. And this is our lovely Cornell plantations, and just had to get that in there. My study had two parts. I did a series of interviews with 9 public gardens at colleges and universities, and I wanted to ask a variety of questions. These are the institutions, so Arnold at Harvard, Smith College, Cornell, of course. Garvin is a beautiful garden that's 175 miles apart from its campus in Arkansas, and just gave an interesting insight into its challenges that it has in reaching students. Ralston in North Carolina, Mathai at University of Michigan, Morris Arboretum, University of Pennsylvania, Scott Arboretum at Swarthmore, and UC Davis. It was a broad, different kinds of gardens, so it gave me a lot of different perspectives. Key to what I was looking for from these gardens was the mission that, not only the mission of the garden, but of the university, and how they complemented each other. So this quotation is one that was posed to public gardens as saying, to stay relevant, be sure that your mission is in the vein of the mission of your overarching organization, the university. And then this was another thought that came out of these interviews, was the concern about being not academic enough. At least one garden voiced this concern, that it was afraid of embracing other types of initiatives because it might not appear academic enough, that it was just seen as a beautiful place, which is an interesting way of looking at it, that it's somehow bad. But so this is something I wanted to think about more throughout the process. My questions were very basic questions about just access to the garden and how they market themselves, but also more questions related to well-being, how it's stated in mission statements, what types of spaces they offer, if they have any involvement with health services, those types of questions. And so a large area of what I was looking at were statements of mission and vision. And I just put up Cornell, for instance, just a couple snippets that show how they're very much related. Cornell with enhancing lives and livelihoods of students, and Cornell plantations with enhancing collections for the enrichment of students. So there's definitely an interplay. And I looked at the text of these statements for all these gardens and their universities, and looked for how they might introduce the topic of well-being or reaching students. My observations from the mission statements part of the research was few had really direct references, but there were a couple that actually talked about how gardens and how the university is reaching out to benefit student lives, and particularly actually making reference to well-being. But those were few. Otherwise, there was, I believe there was more of a perception that they were helping students in this way, but not so much actually making this an explicit mission. I identified different types of references that were indirect, things that referenced sustainability or other aspects that gestured towards well-being, and there were many of these, and I saw them as opportunities for the garden to embrace as ways of getting into the topic of well-being and when I asked the gardens for spaces that they considered restorative and that promoted this feeling of getting away, that I found in the literature. Usually highly designed areas were mentioned. Natural areas too. A couple times Asian theme gardens were referenced as being considered restorative. And sometimes those that were at a distance from the campus or that contained a structure within it were referenced as being considered restorative. So these are some images from some of these gardens, including plantations, but also spaces that have been considered by the people that I spoke with as being restorative. In terms of programming, 5 of the gardens had programs that were about addressing well-being. Often, or most all of them, were an exercise program or more of physical health. 2 of those gardens had programs specifically for student well-being, and plantations being one of them. And so I think there's definitely something going on, just it hasn't actually filtered down to students specifically yet. But there are some developments that are happening. The escape program at Morris Arboretum is an exciting one to watch. They have the issue of being about 10 miles away from downtown Philadelphia, the campus. So enticing students to get away and to get away from the busy downtown environment, the Morris Arboretum has really taken advantage of different types of media to market to students through the notion of escape. And it's been very successful and offering transportation particularly, but this has been a successful example of trying to get students out in nature. And then with working together with health services, only a few have had active conversations. Again, plantations is in there. And two of these gardens have had that relationship started as a result of student suicides. That was just an interesting one to keep aware of, that often these calamities actually promote these conversations, and would it be the other way around, that would be really wonderful, that they would be approached before these types of events happen. I wanted to get a narrower picture besides what was happening in public gardens across the board. So I had a ready sample here at Cornell, and I wanted to just get some student perspectives as opposed to administrators of public gardens, is what I was speaking with. So I did a few surveys of a variety of students. I wanted to compare 2 types of students, ones that are focused more on nature, such as in horticulture, and then students who are notoriously not focused on nature, engineering students, and who actually have a reputation at Cornell as being the most stressed of all students. But I don't know if that's true. So my survey was just a simple paper survey with asking a variety of questions about their level of stress, for one thing. And what was interesting was the horticulture students and engineers, although I had about some different numbers of how many students I interviewed, the same percentages had a high level of frequent stress. So it was basically proportional on the kinds of stress that they were reporting. So most of them had several times a week. And then another large chunk was those who said all the time. And taken together, those are about 74%. And it was equal to the engineers as well. So that was interesting for me to find. And also I asked about coping strategies, eating more, sleeping more. As far as activities involving nature, going outside, spending time in nature. These activities tended to be more likely done by horticulture students as opposed to the engineers. I don't know why horticulture students were 2 times more likely to consume or drink drugs. That's a little troubling, but it was also interesting that they were more likely to spend time in nature. The notion of whether nature prescriptions, I asked students whether they thought nature prescriptions, such as being prescribed to take a walk in nature, whether that would be an effective treatment for stress and for other illnesses. And those who said that it would be very effective tended to rate the benefits of nature to well-being, and also the value that they placed on green things on campus. They rated those areas the highest. Those who rated the connection between nature and well-being lower, and also who valued nature less, actually did not like the idea of nature prescriptions as much. So there was a connection there. I asked about what prevents you from spending more time outside. Engineers were more likely in certain areas not to know where places were. It wasn't what their friends were doing, and just a preference for being indoors. And then what I wanted to get across here was that those who reported that nature was beneficial to well-being and that campus green was important to them, when they rated it the highest, that coincided with the number of times that they visited a public garden, or Cornell plantations in this case. The ones who go to plantations every day, they also valued nature the most. And then the ones who never, or only once a year, would go into any of the areas of plantations, they rated the value of nature to well-being very low, or also the value of green and plants was rated lower the fewer times that they would spend at plantations. I wanted to find out what might entice students to come to plantations more, and top being more transportation being offered, events and activities, Wi-Fi. Some were you just can't get to them, so they're and at the end I just had recommendations, one being that making a case for well-being, and often getting it down in writing is very helpful. Having it in a mission, and if it's not, try to see if you can get it in there, because it's something that everybody can work from. Trying to make a link between academic performance and well-being might help this cause be promoted more, because there is that concern of being relevant, and often for universities it's the academic achievement is the top. So showing the connection between how well-being often and how nature experiences can really boost your concentration and your ability to perform. That might be a way for gardens to say, look at us, and this is an important thing we can do for the organization, for the university. Not only just being a garden, but coming at it with others, such as health services. Don will be telling you about an initiative here at Cornell that is doing this very thing. Looking at the garden and seeing what types of spaces it has that could be considered restorative, and really marketing those to students. Getting ideas from other gardens, like the Escape program at Morris, or just taking a step. There's a grassroots organization called Active Minds that was started at UPenn in the wake of a student suicide, and this group has just grown, and they do awareness events at universities, and it would be interesting to have maybe host one of those events at a public garden and get involved in that conversation, and just staying open-minded as a way of being a living classroom, but also promoting other issues, and student well-being is a pretty important one. So I'm going to hand this over to Don, who will talk about Nature RX.
Thank you, Erica, and I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk about an initiative with which we've been involved for a couple of years now. In fact, it was a meeting of the Land Subcommittee of the President's Sustainable Campus Committee, where Marianne Krasny, a professor in natural resources, David Cutter, the university landscape architect, and I got together on the side, and we were collectively bemoaning the fact that there were so few efforts on campus to really encourage students to spend time outdoors. And one of us, and actually I'm not even sure at this point who it was, had heard about an effort that a group of progressive physicians in the Washington, D.C. area had started in conjunction with the National Park Service. And that partnership led to something called Nature Prescriptions, in which these physicians were for patients who were suffering from anxiety or extreme stress or obesity-related issues. They were actually writing prescriptions for those individuals to spend time out in the local national parks. The contribution by the Park Service was to develop very detailed descriptions of each of their holdings in the greater DC area. What types of natural features were present, how difficult the paths were to walk on, how you can access them by car or public transportation. And this seemed to us like a great model for transferring to Cornell. So it was at that point that we started to organize a group of faculty, staff, clinicians from Gannett, and graduate and undergraduate students under the theme of Nature RX at Cornell. And as you can see, our very simple goal is to reduce stress and thereby increase physical and mental health in students through their engagement with nature, and hopefully through that engagement to cultivate in students an increased appreciation for nature. So in the 2 intervening years since we first created this group, we have achieved a number of goals. We've done a lot of research. We've discovered that there's a national group that calls itself Nature RX Terra Mater. And if you Google Nature RX, you will see that they have very, very funny videos that are intended for a youth audience. When you see something beautiful and all you can think about is Instagram filters, you may need to spend more time out in nature. And both of the videos that that group has developed thus far are in that sort of lighthearted vein, but with a very serious message that we all need to spend more time out in nature. So we feel that in promoting nature to students, we need to focus on some easily graspable benefits that the time in nature will provide. So we are talking about the need to be active. Are you worried about sluggishness? Time outdoors is one of the best predictors of being physically active which can help to maintain healthy heart, healthy weight. Get smarter. This is something that appeals to students. Are you preparing for an exam? Time that you spend in nature enhances cognitive functioning and attention. Sometimes time out in nature can be better than an hour of cramming before a prelim. Get engaged. Are you feeling isolated? Which is, as Erica was explaining, a very common cause of stress and anxiety among students. So find a walking, running, or hiking club. Research suggests that nature is a social magnet that draws people together and fosters social interaction. And get well. And this really is the essence of what we are focusing on. If you're feeling bad, just take a short daily walk to improve your feeling of well-being. So in what ways are we carrying out this Nature RX approach? One that was very interesting and very successful this past fall is that Sonia Skelly led a first-year student class called Take It Outside, in which each week the student enrollees were led by a different Cornell expert to explore one of Cornell's magnificent natural areas in a different way. We've been working for several months on a See You in Nature app and website, and very recently we were really gratified that the IT team at Student Services has taken over the further development of this app and website, and we're going to be very actively and heavily promoting those, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Something that we're quite excited about is that in following up on that Washington, D.C. model, the clinicians at Cornell Health, what we have known as Gannett in the past, are now actually writing paper prescriptions that they hand out to students that say, nature is beneficial to you, we want you to go out in nature, and then they can check boxes once a week, twice a week, 4 times a week. And the clinicians at Gannett are very interested in conducting a study of those students who have received these prescriptions to see what impact it has on them over time. We are starting to promote the benefits of time in nature in the ways that I was just explaining through various media. You know, I'm an old faculty member, so I don't really know what students follow these days, but we've discovered there's something called Slope Media, which has both a paper publication and an online, constantly changing website and blog. So we have an interview set up later this week with one of the editors at Slope Media. We're also working with members of the Student Assembly to get an article in the Daily Sun. One of the undergraduate students that Marcia Eames Sheevely worked with last fall did a comprehensive study of every course offered at Cornell to see which ones are currently utilizing nature to enhance their teaching, which ones could benefit from greater use of time outdoors, and which ones are never going to get outside. We are in early discussions with faculty in the Department of Communications about building a research project around messaging of encouraging students to spend time outdoors, to see how different forms of messaging, different messages themselves will have impact. And we have a meeting this coming Saturday in which we've invited student representatives from organizations across campus to come together and to advise us on how we can make the Nature RX efforts more effective, more impactful for all of them. So one of the earliest things or earliest efforts in our Nature RX initiative was the development of a campus map by David Cutter, our university landscape architect, in which he pointed out some of the key natural areas on campus, like Beebe Lake and both Cascadilla and Fall Creek Gorges. That was sort of the jumping off point for us to work with a graduate student in information sciences to develop an app called See You in Nature that includes many of the natural areas that are managed by Cornell Plantations, as well as natural areas in the center of campus like Wee Stinky Glen, Tiger Glen, and as of last week, the Liberty Hyde Bailey Conservatory. And here you can see a couple of the pages from that app, and this IT specialist from Student Services, who I was mentioning, is now working on the further development of that and a companion website. So the idea here is not to have students be studying this app or website on their iPhones while they're out in nature, but rather to have them become familiar with the spectacular natural sites that exist here at Cornell, and to learn how far it is from their dorm. There's going to be a new feature on the website in which a user can say, how far am I from the closest natural area right now? And it will tell how many minutes the walk is to that site and how to get there. An effort we were involved with this past November with President Beth Garrett, who is in our thoughts, was also called Take It Outside, and it was a walk around Beebe Lake and to the plantation's winter garden for students and members of both the Cornell and local community. And through Nature RX, we anticipate running more and more events like this. Simple events to just get people out in nature and to find how close and how attractive and how enjoyable it is. And this is a shot from the Take It Outside class that Sonia Skelly ran this past fall. Here's another shot, and one of the things about getting out in nature is that you need to do it in all types of weather. And as you can see, the students were going down the gorge with Sarah Fiorello, and were mostly prepared for that in terms of their clothing. So what I'd like to say in wrapping this up is that we have simultaneously both a very, very highly stressed and anxious student body, and the statistics that Erica was sharing earlier bear those out. The counselors from the CAPS program at Cornell Health, Counseling and Psychological Services, indicate that between 18 and 20% of all undergraduates seek their support each year. That's an enormous number. So at the same time we have this very stressed student body, we also have one of the most beautiful campuses in the world. I mean, look at this. That's right next to the engineering quad. So we feel that we have this incredible opportunity to use the natural beauty of our campus, of Cornell Plantations, to entice students outside and to contribute to their overall well-being. So thank you. Any questions for Erica or myself?
I have this kind of a weird question. So if the stress is created under a natural environment, would pursuing nature still be a way to release your stress? like for example, this might not be unfamiliar to a horticulture student because sometimes we work in the field or collecting sample in the forest for a very long time, and that creates the stress.
You want to handle that one?
I never expected that question.
I think it's a great question, and I think that time in nature can have certain stresses associated with it. One, as you point out, is if you're there really doing work, in order to get that work completed can be stressful. Another is that if you're not certain of the route that you're following, it's easy to become stressed about finding your way back to the starting point. And I recall that when I was in Costa Rica several years ago, there was a program to get kids from within San Jose, the capital city, who had spent no time in nature, to just step into woods. And that in itself was very stressful for them because it was such an unfamiliar environment. So just becoming familiar and comfortable with nature is often the first step.
I think it's a matter of mindfulness of what you're choosing to focus on, or moving your attention off of the research onto the less demanding environment around you. So it's a choice, I guess, of letting yourself get off of one thing onto the other.
Taking a 5-minute break from data collection.
I just don't know how to phrase this, but it seems like, I mean, like you were saying, it's stressful for people sometimes who aren't familiar with nature to step into it because there's no familiarity with it. I've often thought that like incorporating some kind of identification skills like just go hand in hand, because I always see you walk in, any urban person or any person who doesn't spend time in nature will walk into the kitchen and identify everything in the kitchen and know when something's out of place. Yet in nature, they don't know what's safe, what's not safe. Often the urban environment is safe for them, you know. So, like, do you think about how maybe to incorporate, or do you think that's important, incorporating those?
I think that was definitely the case. One study was that the natural areas, the more wild areas, were not approached because they were afraid of them or just didn't know about them. And I think they were trying to get at the idea of interpretation as the answer. If these were actually, people took time to describe these places, to actually make them more familiar, they would be used more. And also in the survey that students many raised that concern that they wouldn't be safe, or they had many different types of concern about spending time outside. So I think taking that time to speak to the students and interpret what these places are and what they're going to find there, and also teaching them about nature, learning about what plants are. The more you know, the more you see, the more you enjoy. So.
Yes?
Yeah, so from your survey data, it seemed like there was a pretty strong correlation between time spent outdoors and appreciation of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Is that causational? Is it a chicken and egg thing? Like, do you love nature because you spend time outdoors, or the other way around, or do they both kind of feed back into each other?
That's a really good question. I did think about that a lot. I think what I was trying to at least argue was that the more, if a love of nature can be established, then there'll be a greater use of it. And so as far as which causes which, I don't know. Sometimes for some it might be greater knowledge, and hence being more familiar with something creates that love and enjoyment of nature. For others, it might be that love draws them to want to learn more about it. So I think it is a give and take, and I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah.
Yes. Geneva, any questions? Al?
No question, Trump.
Okay, thanks.
Let me take one more.
Yeah, we'll take one more question. Phil?
Erica, do you think that, getting back to the question of being out in a wilder area might be stressful, do you think that that could be an example of how important it is having smaller, more controlled gardens on a campus could be truly beneficial? A small garden where you're not going to get lost. A small garden that is obviously man-made construction close to your building, but still would have the benefit of being around trees, being around fence for this 5-10 minutes.
Absolutely, and I think there really isn't, at least some of the data was trying to show that it didn't matter if it was urban nature or more rural nature, just any amount of green really was beneficial. So taking it in more bite-sized pieces, definitely places right around buildings seem to be very popular and so easy to get to that I think the ease of access is a huge factor. So yeah, definitely there's a value to these smaller spaces, and hopefully campuses can maybe keep cultivating them. And yeah.
Thank you.
Don Rakow.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.